Hello, and welcome to today's Mind Your Career webinar program. My name is Sam Constance, and I work with the Alumni Career Development team here at the University of Chicago. Thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar entitled The Transformative Power of Job Crafting. A little bit about our presenter. Kevin Jordan is an International Coach Federation certified executive coach who serves as a strategic advisor, mentor, and facilitator to executive leadership teams and private clients to achieve peak performance and agility, resulting in sustained engagement and value. He provides expert guidance to leaders of companies at all stages of maturity and across industries. Kevin's professional career has included roles in healthcare, consulting, and coaching with significant strategic and operational expertise. He's directly managed, mentored, and coached professionals at all career stages. Kevin graduated with a Bachelor in Public Policy Studies from the University of Chicago. Without further ado now, I'd like to introduce Kevin Jordan.
Thanks, Sam. Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. 1 second. Okay, can everybody see the slides? All right, Sam?
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, Sam. Apologies for the technical glitch. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to join this webinar. I know it's a trying time, and I hope everybody's families are safe and healthy, and that you're all doing well. So as Sam talked about, today's presentation is really around the transformative power of job crafting. This is the concept that arose about 20 years ago through work by Amy Wojcicki, Jane Dutton, and Justin Berg. And it took on quite a bit of resonance actually in the 2008 financial crisis, the Great Recession. And it essentially is it's a concept that allows folks to be able to look at their job from a different perspective, as a series of building blocks that they can actually move around and transform. That allows them to leverage their strengths, their skills, and their other innate passions and abilities to actually move their careers and their jobs in a direction that better aligns with their overall purpose. And it's certainly, even though it's taken on greater resonance in the current times and also in the Great Recession, it's actually a concept that can be done throughout any point in your career, and actually should be. It's a really powerful tool, and we'll get more into that as we move forward. As I alluded to, I really believe it's more relevant now than ever, because there's a couple of flavors of where this is happening. One is folks are actively trying to transform their careers proactively, or their jobs proactively, and this can be a great framework for that. But there's also a series of folks that have had their roles readjusted or recalibrated without a lot of control, and they're now trying to figure out what does that mean and how can they regain some control over that. And so this concept of job crafting is driven with our ability to look from within about what makes us who we are, what are our strengths, what are the relevant components, skills, and abilities that we want to bring to the fore, and then use that capacity from within to start to transform our jobs and our career trajectories. So just a little kind of guide for our time today. We'll spend just a little bit of time looking at the current work context. We'll dive then into what constitutes effective job crafting. We'll then look at what is needed for this to be beneficial, and not just to you, but to your larger team and ultimately your company. We'll spend a bit of time looking at the value of how effective job crafting can facilitate your career growth and other development areas that you want to pursue. And then finally, we'll just look at some practical steps in order to actually implement successful job crafting, with the goal of being able to realize your future professional aspirations. And then, as Sam alluded to, we'll happy to take questions at the end. So with that, setting the context, so many folks may have been aware of the VUCA concept, which is an acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. This is a concept that was around several years ago. It's quite popular. I actually think it's relevant now again more than ever, given the current context. And really, it's looking at, if we break each of the four components down, we're seeing in the volatility space a high rate of change. And there was already a lot of change going on prior to coronavirus, and that's only accelerated in ways that we just couldn't have imagined a couple of months ago. We're seeing increased levels of uncertainty. So, lots of lack of clarity in the present, and even more lack of clarity about what's coming. What is the next thing that we need to be prepared for, and what does that look like, and how can we shape our careers to be ready for that? Things have only gotten more complex, so there's just even more decision factors that have to be weighed, more bits of data that have to be considered. And finally, it's tremendously ambiguous. So we're still trying to kind of figure out, what does all this mean in the current time? What is it going to mean going forward? And what will that look like, and how can we best respond? So I thought this was kind of a good recap to kind of set the context for how things have been going. And we were living in this kind of environment even prior to coronavirus. I just think it's taken on even greater resonance and more amplification. So with that as a backdrop, we have been expected to, and we are desiring to really be kind of career architects, right? So how can we shape our own careers, take ownership in the context of a constantly changing world? And so you see words here that resonate with folks: adaptability, agility, increasing our skills. One of the key concepts in terms of ongoing career ownership is really being what I call a serial learner. So how do you keep evolving? How do you keep using your strengths and your knowledge and expanding those to develop yourself? And then really trying to align all that with what inspires and drives you, so that your values and your passion. So taking the whole aggregate of that and being able to move forward in a constantly changing environment, so we can continue to adapt, continue to be agile, and be able to respond to the next new demands, many of which we're seeing right now. We don't know what those are going to be. So really kind of having more of a framework approach and a mental model approach to kind of augment and accelerate your domain expertise. So we spend a lot of time constructing, a lot of energy looking around at how to put our careers together, how to point them in the right direction, and we're investing a lot of time in doing this. So I threw this slide in here because I like this tidbit it's about 80,000 hours approximately a full-time worker will spend over the course of their working lives doing just things associated with work. So we're trying to architect these careers to have meaning, to have purpose, and to have value, and really also spending a significant amount of time. And so we want to see, what can we do with that time? How can we align things to our greater purpose and make that time count? Because it is a tremendous investment in both ourselves and our ongoing development. And yet, most of folks don't feel so hot about the state of work. So in late 2019, PricewaterhouseCoopers Strategy and Group, they commissioned a global survey that they dubbed the Crisis of Purpose. And I'm just going to spend a couple of slides highlighting some of their findings. So they looked across these 5 dimensions: passion, excited, motivated, satisfied, proud, and they found pretty low rates of response in terms of how people feel in terms of their positivity. And in fact, only 20% of folks felt at least somewhat positive across all 5 dimensions. And I can say, speaking from my own coaching practice of late, talking to people, and last week seemed to be the week that everybody hit the wall, that motivation piece really resonated for folks both individually and those that lead teams, really struggling, trying to stay motivated, either in the context of having to be working from home, which they're not used to, or working with folks in a remote way, which they haven't done necessarily in the past. So really trying to adjust and recalibrate and find that motivation. And not surprisingly, a lot of folks aren't terribly satisfied right now. They're really kind of struggling through about how to make this work. So as we look about kind of this general sense of not such a hot feeling about the state of modern work, not surprisingly, a lot of folks do not feel connected to their organizations. And so this data, again, is pretty staggering in terms of, we're looking from left to right there. Less than 30% folks feel like they're fully connected to what the purpose of their company. Just about 40% can see the value that they actually create day to day, and 22% of folks feel like the jobs actually leverage their strengths. So looking at this in total, this quote is quite apt here. How do you expect people to kind of show up day to day if they can't really connect to the purpose of the company? They're unsure about the work that they're doing and the value that it creates, and more to the point, it doesn't allow them to use the strengths that they do well. So it paints a rather bleak picture of where folks are in terms of the state of modern work and how they can connect all the great gifts that they have into doing something that actually feels rewarding and aligns to their larger value structure. And so many people hit the decision point here. And this is work that was done by Adam Grant, his book Originals, that's based off of research from the economist Albert Hirschman. So you end up having potentially 4 choices. So across the bottom, you can focus on maintaining the status quo, which in this example here, or this framework here, is you're really just neglecting, or you're persisting and kind of grinding out and hoping that the current status will change, but not really taking any active measures there to change your situation. Across the top, you have 2 pretty diametrically opposed choices. You can either exit the organization or the job or situation, which in the context of these times right now, or in the Great Recession 10, 12 years ago, wasn't very practical. Either there weren't the jobs that aligned with where people wanted to go, or the sense of a lack of security inhibited kind of the free flow of movement between work. So that leaves giving voice. And so what does voice look like? So voice is an active effort to reach out to your management team, reach out to your manager and say, hey, this is something I want to change. I need your help in doing that. And I think it could look like X or Y. There's a couple of conditions for voice. One, Grant point out that in order to even give voice, you have to believe as an employee that what you're going to say matters and that there's actually a likelihood that things can change. And I would add one other condition too, just based on the work that I've seen with my own clients, is and being able to answer the question, does the work that I do matter, and is this organization or team, or however you want to measure the unit, worthy of my gifts? And assuming you can answer yes to both of those, and by no means is that an exhaustive list, there may be others, then really you're in a position to start to articulate, okay, what would that voice look like and how do I want to shape this? And so the rest of this presentation really focuses on the assumption that folks give voice and are active in terms of how they're crafting not only the overall arc of their career, but the particular job that they're doing right at that time. Okay. So that leads to a couple of flavors of voice. There's this concept of compromise. And so there's a great, and it's referenced here, there's a great blog post from Avinash Kashak from several years ago when he did a nice piece on what he called his manifesto for a magnificent career. And he really talked about these kind of concepts about passion, the skills and work that we do relative to what companies value. And so, if we imagine we're going to give voice and we're going to move forward, and then one way to start doing that is, well, what might a compromise be if you're not actually doing something that you really want to do now that aligns around these overlapping circles? And so that involves figuring out, well, what are you truly passionate about? And then relative to that, what are you doing right now in your career or even in your job that has at least some touch point to that? And then more importantly, how do those touch points relate to what your company or your team needs and values? And so for many people, this can be a really great starting point. They start to kind of figure out, well, what does this kind of look like? Everybody's circles may overlap in a little bit of different direction, but they're starting to heading down a path that's much more resonant for them. Well, then there's also this next phase, though, that he talks about as nirvana, which is really where you see all the circles come together. So in terms of our passions, what our companies value, and actually what you do in the context of your work, all lines up. Now this is a pretty idealized and aspirational state, and for many people that may not be possible, but there is an opportunity to at least be thinking and framing and moving things along the way where the circles become closer and closer. And I have to, speaking from my own experience, only in the last year or two have I've gotten pretty close to where all the circles overlap through a series of kind of both career job crafting, but also career crafting, but also job crafting within the context of the career, and kind of being very deliberate about merging those paths and getting closer and closer and closer to the centrics, kind of the circles overlapping. So this is what Laura Otting calls consonants, the concept of professional consonance. So whereas he used nirvana, she talks about this sense of frictionless belonging, of core relevance, so that it becomes a guiding light, kind of a North Star in terms of how our work really fits into our overall life plan. So really who we are, what we do, what gives us meaning, what gets us value, How are we able to align our work and our responsibilities to fall into that overall superstructure? And the great thing about it is it's your purpose, and it's clearly defined by you. So you are in control. You have agency around how you want to direct and scope that in the context of what's most important to you from a value and life structure. So she sees 4 key components that are needed for consonance, and they're each broken out here. So one of the first key things is just the calling, and that's this pull, this what she refers to as this gravitational pull towards something, a goal, a role that's bigger than us, right? So really kind of understanding what is that calling and why is that important to you. Within the context of the calling, we then start to talk about connection. So this idea that you get sight lines into how your everyday work really fits into that calling. So we're really trying to kind of winnow in here on that. Then there's contribution. So this is really getting an understanding of how that job, how that role, how your career contributes to who you want to be and where you want to go. And finally, there's the concept of control. And this just really reflects how much influence do you have in terms of what you do day in and day out, how much say in terms of structuring the way your work portfolio is. And so this framework right here really starts to kind of counteract some of the data that we saw in the Price Waterhouse studies in terms of where people didn't feel like they had control, and they didn't feel like they had a lot of connection. So really trying to take this and start to shape it in a different direction. And so that leads a lot of folks to what El Luna referred to in a great essay on Medium several years ago as the crossroads of should versus must. And so from her perspective, should is really the exogenous external variables that come in and bring to bear on us, what people expect of us, what society expects of us, what we think should be done. Really these external variables and attributes that we put upon ourselves or put on us, as opposed to must. And must really starts by looking from within, what she refers to as that luminous space from within about what really grabs us, what really calls to us, and what do we actually need to do. And for those that are interested in reading her story, it's actually quite fascinating because it was all about how she shifted her career into a must. And it was scary, and it was something she had never done before, but it felt like where she had to go. And for a lot of people, when they get to this point, the should versus must, the must becomes pretty obvious. And then what's the best way, tool-wise, framework-wise, to kind of effectuate that must going forward? And that's what we'll spend some more time talking about in the next few slides. So enter the concept of job crafting. And you can see here just kind of the metamorphosis in the slide represented by the butterfly. But this is really a framework and a set of tools to go from that kind of getting your passions, your skills, your ideas kind of figured out, and then starting to actually get more practical about, okay, how would you implement this? What would that look like moving forward? And we'll spend some time kind of talking about that. So as we said at the top of the program here, your job really, you can look at it as a set of building blocks, and in the context of those blocks, then they can be used to kind of reconfigure and actually start to think about and put together a new experiential way of how you want to show up at work or how you want to show up in your career. That ideally is going to get you more engaged and more fulfilled, and be able to direct the things that you do well, your strengths, into areas that not only are of value to you, but they're of value to your team and to the larger company. So in essence, job crafting is composed of several key components. So first and foremost, it's a self-driven process. So this is not something where you need to wait for your manager or your HR department or anything to kind of start or impose upon you. You can do this at any point in your career. And it really begins by having a really firm and clear assessment of where you are currently in your professional role. What are the values that are important to you? What are the strengths that you bring? What are the skills and knowledge and other experiences that you can add and bring to bear to the organization? And then really taking a step back and zooming out and reimagining and redefining and personalizing all that in a way that best reflects your authentic self. And the idea here is that you're driving toward, your professional goals, and potentially what I refer to as a new professional North Star in terms of where you want to arc either that particular job or maybe it's arcing that job in the context of also arcing your career at the same time. So this process really allows folks to have a lot of agency and control over their career. They're able to really kind of be the driver of this. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not a one and done kind of thing. In my experience, people are doing job crafting throughout the course of their career all the time. It varies in intensity and it varies at timing, and sometimes it's much more significant in terms of the structural reimagining of your work portfolio. Sometimes it's more tactical. So it really just depends on where you are in the overall arc of your career and what you think are the next most important things to keep you moving and advancing down that career and growing and learning, much as we talked about earlier in terms of that kind of career architecture and self-navigation. So as you undertake job crafting, there's three key areas that you can sort of start to move around, and they center around tasks, relationships, and perception. And you can choose to alter one or all of them if you like. And so we'll say a little bit about each one, then I'll give you a couple of examples from some clients who are doing this actively now. So in terms of tasks, this is pretty straightforward. You can look at the work that you have right now and either decide or make a plan to reduce the volume of those tasks or increase. You could also think about what the scope of those tasks are and think about reimagining how that particular scope. You might even change actually how you do them. There might be different ways to do your work where you're not actually changing the task itself, but your approach to them. In the context of relationships, this can look like reimagining and changing how and or who you interact with professionally. And then finally, perception. This is really the cognitive piece around the reframing of what your role might be. And it could be a small piece of your role, it could be the entirety of your role. So again, you can use these three buckets to guide your work, and you decide which one or all of them are important to you as you make your switch. So in the context of a couple of clients right now, I have one who's been very proactive about her job crafting. So prior to the coronavirus, she was really identifying that she was a great problem solver. She was quite restless in her roles. She kind of switched roles every couple of years, very sharp and very valued within the context of her large financial services firm. And so we have been doing some work to really focus on the perception piece of how to imagine not just being in this role that she was in, but what was she really good at? And she really boiled down to being an excellent problem solver. And she didn't really want to go outside and do consulting. She wanted to do this kind of work within the context of her large firm. And so we started talking about what that could look like. She started altering who she was showing up to in terms of her relationships with other mentors and peers and executives within the organization. And then coronavirus hit, and they needed someone to lead the task force around training and preparation for the PPP work. And so she was tapped to do that. So she was already in a position where she'd been reframing her approach to her work. She now had the opportunity to actually execute against that. So here she was kind of being in this problem solving mode, building programs, training folks. She was altering her relationships because now she was front and center with all the senior executives in the company. And actually the fundamental nature of her work changed in terms of her tasks, what she did, how she did them. And she's realized now that she actually, we were just talking last week, she said, Kevin, I can't go back to my old job. And so she now has openings because she's stepped into this breach, and other folks on the senior executive team have started asking her, hey, we have organizations and groups that do the kinds of things you want to do. Would you like to come and join? So she's going to have an interesting inflection point coming up about what she wants to do. So that's an example of someone who's being proactive. They were doing some work along the way. This terribly unfortunate set of circumstances arose. She saw opportunity in it, and she jumped on it, and it's working out quite well for her. I have another client who's on the precipice of becoming an executive in a large hospitality organization. Walked in one day, her team went from 20 to 1, and they were all furloughed. And all of a sudden, she was down to just her, one direct report, and her existing manager. And so she had to work across all three of these dimensions. So first and foremost, she was now actually doing tasks that she hadn't done for 2 or 3 jobs because there was no one else there to actually do it. So she had to kind of reframe around what that would look like and actually doing that work. The relationship with her direct report didn't change so much. It was more the relationship with her boss, who had previously given her a fair amount of autonomy, but since both of their scopes had so winnowed down, her boss was much more in her business and in the day-to-day in a way that she had never been. So they had to renegotiate and are renegotiating how they work together and how that will work going forward. And finally, and this is where we spent the most time, or have spent the most time in terms of our coaching engagement, is really figuring out how does she reframe this new and likely temporary role, but a new role which she was not on track for. As I mentioned, she was on the verge of a promotion into the executive ranks, and that's been delayed. And now here she is with a very small team in a role that has largely been handed to her, and really working through how does she manage that change and still show up in a way where she can help her boss and help the one direct report and the larger organization, because they are deemed key to that in that function for the company to keep moving that piece of work forward. So this is more of an example of where this was reactive, because this was foisted on her. So you get a couple of different flavors there. So the benefits of job crafting, they're pretty pronounced. And these, before I kind of get into these, I think it's important to note that these are benefits that are accrued regardless of where you sit in the organization and or regardless of your occupation or industry. So again, this shows the general applicability of this framework and how you can use it at any point in your career and at any point in the organization. So these folks found that when people do this and they do this well, they have higher levels of professional engagement. You know, they want to be at work, they're motivated to do work, they're feeling good about it. Not surprisingly, their satisfaction goes up, their sense of accomplishments goes up. They have more control over what they're doing, they're able to direct their portfolio in ways that helps them and helps the organizations. And as a result, their overall job performance increases. So they're generally much more satisfied. They have their degree of agency, which we talked a little bit about earlier, has increased, and they ultimately have much more control over where they're directing their career and their actual day-to-day tasks. And then this final piece, which is super important, I think, in this period, is job crafting allows your personal resilience to go up too. And so, you know, if ever there was a time when many of us are being tested by our resilience is being tested by external factors way out of our control, this is it. And this process allows you to have a greater degree of resilience. And I think that's really attributable to the agency and control that you have, because you're so much more invested in shaping and directing what you want and how you want to get it. There's 3 keys to success for effective job crafting. So the first and foremost, and you've heard me say this a few times, you need to figure out what is a strength or series of strengths that you want to deploy either to your team and or to the larger organization. And that's not only going to create value for you, but it's actually going to create value for others. You know, so going back to my one client who's kind of the chief problem solver, you know, most of her reason for being is looking around the corner and trying to find new things that's going to help the organization get to a different direction. And it may be things the organization knows is a problem, but it may be things they don't know yet, just because of where she sits in that organization. A second key step is to build trust. And this typically starts with your manager. So I mentioned that job crafting can be self-directed. You don't necessarily need to involve your manager, but that decision point really depends on the scope and extent of job crafting that you're going to perform. So if you're making minor adjustments to your role, your portfolio that aren't a huge deal and probably wouldn't need a lot of input, you probably could do that on your own. If you're looking to substantially renegotiate what you were hired to do or your overall work portfolio, you're going to need help and support. And typically that's going to start with your manager, because they want them to understand where you're going, why you want to go there, how can they help, and then craft a plan, which we'll talk about in a few slides, around how to get there. The third key component is this concept of accommodation. And this is really getting at how do you take your job crafting efforts and aim them towards folks in the organization that will most likely help. So really being able to identify needs and deploy your own strengths and skills in ways that actually satisfy you, but also really are helping to solve the problems or make other parts of the organization work in a better way. And then going to those folks and enlisting them in terms of their support, saying, hey, I'd like to make a contribution here. I think it could look like this. Would this be helpful? And how can we help each other? So really three keys to success in order to kind of effectually do this. Okay, so what's an effective way to start? When I work with a lot of my clients, we kind of start across the top of the slide here. So we really spend some time defining and taking an inventory of values. So really, what is most important to you, and why are those values most important to you? And usually we'll kind of prioritize and rank order them to really kind of hone in. Then really want to talk about your purpose. So what motivates you? What gets you excited? You know, where do you want to deploy your greatest gifts? What are the strengths that you have? So the things that you actually do really well, the skills and expertise you have that sets you apart, you know, really being clear about what those are. What is your knowledge? What do you have to offer? You know, your domain expertise, other knowledge you may have that can be deployed in different ways. And finally, what are some of the previous experiences that you've had that you want to build on? You want to use as leverage or as your building blocks to kind of move forward. So as we're doing that, then we're also really getting clear on, you know, what is our from, so that's your current starting point, but more importantly, where do you want to go? So what's the future destination and position? And in this exercise, I really like to use language around when you're looking out and imagining your two is I have, I am, I do. So it's very active. It's not things like I will, or I would like, or I wish, which can lead to sort of kind of less concrete and less definitive approaches and statements. So I'm a big fan of being able to to kind of put a stake in the ground and declare where you want to go, why that's important to you, and then craft your plan to aim for that. So as we're starting that process and going through, then it's important to get some cycles of validation and refinement. And so in this first step here, it's really what I call kind of cultivating this holistic perspective. So as you're starting to look outside, talk to other people, you know, other peers. Obviously, you might be talking to your manager. You might talk to folks in other parts of the organization. Maybe they don't know you as well, but they might have a point of view that you haven't considered. And it's actually, I think, super important to not just limit your perspective to those that know you well, but actually to those who don't know you as well, and sort of those kind of either weaker ties, or in the current times, there may be something that in an article I just read, somebody referred to as dormant ties, where folks you might not have reached out to in a while, but that you valued their opinion. They may not be as close to your work now, but they might have something important and insightful to offer you in terms of your work or where you want to take your work. You want to take all those perspectives and then reflect and reassess. You know, are there some of the observations and insights helpful? Maybe yes, maybe no. But what really resonates, and what would make this tighter and more direct? Then you want to clarify and refine as needed. And then you start really getting into this sort of start, stop, and continue. So as you're thinking about the new role, you think about the next phase of your career, what are those things in your role that you're going to start doing that are likely new or different? What are you going to stop or significantly reduce doing? And what do you need to continue doing to actually kind of meet the ongoing demands or remit of other parts of your job? So as you have that, then you can move into kind of the development planning phase. And there's a great little simple framework you can use that I've used throughout my career. I learned it as the 3E model of learning. Other folks may have heard it as the 70-20-10 model. But essentially, it's looking at your experiences, your exposure, and your education, these three dimensions in terms of crafting your individual development plan. So really, the key points here is that most people learn by doing. So hence the 70% of experiential. So really being able to actually go and do the thing itself. 20% of the model is usually focused on your exposure. So that's in terms of your relationship to others, in terms of maybe job shadowing or things of that nature. And finally, 10% is really related to your education. This can be formal, this can be informal. And I'm less concerned about getting the percentages correctly. It's more about where you want to direct the lion's share of your energy and attention when you're doing this. I should also say too that in terms of job crafting, even though this is not a focus for today, as we're kind of going through the planning phase, for those of you that manage teams, this is actually an activity you can do at the team level too. And just real quickly, it really looks at kind of at a high level in 3 quick steps. You really look at the kind of the strategic remit you have to the larger organization, what you need to do. You then look at the kind of aspirations and capabilities that you have on your team. So really asking each of the team members, where they're at, what they're good at, what they want to do. Then as a manager, you can take both what you need to do from the organizational perspective and what the team wants to do in terms of their own individual contributions, and then align that work across all the different members in a way that not everybody's going to get everything that they want, but folks get more often the things that they really want to do and that they're really good at. So this can be a powerful thing to do at the team level as well. So, so this kind of is a little bit of a recap slide here in terms for folks who just kind of want to see the high level process sort of all mapped out in terms of the 7 key steps that I've been speaking about previously, all the way from starting the assessment and kind of coming all the way around. I would say, the key steps for me to really focus in on are step 4. So this is this ongoing discussion with your manager and your colleagues, making sure people understand where you're going, why you want to go there, and what kind of help you may need or they may need to provide you. And then really step 6, kind of keeping the discussion going over time. And this whole model is set up in such a way, kind of the rinse and repeat, because as I said before, for most folks, you're never quite done with this. Your job crafting it may vary in its intensity over time, but it's for many people, it's an ongoing process. And then again, this kind of finishing up around, I think of the most important thing is that enlisting of support from other people that can help you. So in terms of you adding value to them and then them being able to support you on this journey. And then we'll end with this quote from Emerson, which I think really speaks a lot, and kind of coming back to what we talked about in terms of the crossroads of should versus must, is really figuring out and tapping into all the wonderful things that lie within us, and then how to really pull those forward in our professional lives in such a way to achieve and move down that path toward professional consonance, and being able to do musts versus should as we move forward in our working lives. And with that, I'm happy to take questions or comments.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. And to those of you who have not submitted any questions yet, please do so now. We'll be going through our Q&A for the next 20 minutes or so. We do have one question here from an audience member that says, what if making changes to my tasks or my relationships is out of my hands as I'm a relatively new employee? I don't feel like I have a lot of control to affect meaningful change in my role.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that one of the ways I would approach that is having if there's things you actually know you want to change, pardon me, or you think you'd like to change, I'd have a conversation with your team leader, your manager, about what those are and why you think they would be important to do it. So you might not be able to do them by yourself without that input, but being able to give voice to that and articulate, what those are, why they would be important, what is the value that they're going to provide if you want to make that switch. I would encourage you to have that conversation and see where it goes, because, for many folks, when I work with them in my coaching practice, I have to remind people a lot of times unspoken needs go unmet. So if your manager or someone else on your team who's in a position to potentially at least listen, if not actually help you make those changes, don't know, then it's really hard. You'll just be stuck in that position. So I would encourage some conversation to really see what's possible.
Great. Here's another question. How do I develop an IDP as a new entrepreneur due to this pandemic?
Oh, wow. A new entrepreneur. Well, it would depend on kind of what in the context of being a new entrepreneur, it would depend on what you're looking to craft. So without knowing more about that question, I would take a step back and sort of, I imagine you had some pretty good reasons for being an entrepreneur. And then what is the business you're in? What are the skills you want to deploy? And what are the strengths you want to use, and then look at how those apply to your new business. And so, being able to take a step back and say, okay, well, I'm in the business of X and I have the role of Y, and I want to move my business, or I want to move my role down this way, and being able to kind of define that future state, and then back into that from like, well, what do I need to do to get there? Is it a skills issue? Is it a knowledge issue? Is it a expertise issue? So without knowing a little bit more about that, that's at least how I would start to kind of approach my thinking around that.
Thank you. And here's another great question. When conducting your individual self-assessment, what are some assessment tools or perhaps software that you can use to help you identify your values and your strengths?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen things on the, pretty low tech where people have just literally made a list of their values. They just kind of either type them up or wrote them down. I like the Strengths Finder. If people have ever done Strengths Finder, that's a good one in terms of finding strengths. It doesn't tap into values per se, but it really, I think there's 35 measures of different strengths that you can get from that. I tend to be a little bit tool agnostic. I mean, I don't, have a bunch that I particularly recommend. I'm always looking for the right tool for the right job. The values one, I haven't found a specific kind of tool that I would recommend in terms of like, a software or platform. I've tended to just kind of make lists of what's important to me and then use that going forward. So yeah, I guess that's how I would answer that question.
We've had a number of questions come in around this same topic here. What strategies can you use to overcome potentially unsupportive managers? And how do you motivate your manager to become a supportive element in this process?
Yeah, well, it kind of depends on what unsupportive looks like. So in terms of managers that either are sort of, benign neglect or actively not helping, one of the first things I've done in actually my own career when I've hit some snags with managers, I've gone to some of their peers, and without throwing people under the bus, of course, just sort of saying, hey, I want to have this conversation with my boss. I think it's going to be a hard one. Here's how I want to approach it. What advice would you give to me, or what am I missing? I found that that's helpful because oftentimes those people know they're working with that manager, so they have a sense of how they work. So being able to kind of frame up what you want to say and how you want to say it to someone who you trust and can give you some honest feedback on that. At the end of the day, it can be a challenge, right? I mean, so I'm always trying to, when I'm approaching a manager or advising a client approaching a manager, I think one of the greatest gifts you can give the manager is, if there's a change you want to make, how is it going to make his or her team better and more effective, and what value can it bring to not only the team but the larger organization? And so it's trying to frame or reframe, in this case, what you're doing and what you want to do and how it's going to help you, but cast that in the larger context of how it's going to help either the manager's team or the larger organization.
Thank you, Kevin. Here's another one. What if you've been typecast into your role to the point that you feel like you can't segue out because of assumptions that are made about people who work in that role? I took a job just to earn money and then ended up in that role for so long that it's now proving extremely difficult to leave my role and my industry.
Yeah, the whole concept of people get mental maps about you or about folks. And that one's harder. I mean, that is, I've seen people do the opposite of job crafting. They've either left the organization or left that team because they couldn't break it. Those that were able to kind of change the model, they really needed an advocate, someone outside of their immediate manager. So either another team they've done work with, or other folks that could actually speak to how their skills have evolved, or how they actually have the potential to do other things. I saw this a lot in my corporate career, where we would be doing calibration sessions at mid-year and year-end, and feedback about a person would follow that person 3, 4, and 5 years. And the best way I kind of worked against that, and I saw all my other colleagues work against it, was to be able to speak up and advocate on behalf of the person in the context of other things that they had been doing. So one way to think about it is, are there other special projects or things that you could volunteer for that are tangential to your immediate role that would allow you to be seen and try to do things in a different way that starts to give you a little momentum and a different perspective that allows people to come back and sort of say, well, hey, so and so actually they're not just about that anymore. They actually can do these kinds of things. But that is a hard one, the typecasting to get around. I'm sorry about that.
Our next question is about networking. Can you talk about networking and managing your network in the context of job crafting, and especially in the context of how networking is changing today?
Yeah, so your network's super key. And I talked a little bit about that concept of the folks that know you well versus the folks that are kind of the weaker ties. So, and there's multiple different types of networks. So there's a network within your organization, there's a network external to your organization. And I'm a big believer, a client of mine uses the phrase, his personal board of directors. And so your network can be as big or as little as you want. I'm much more interested in the value and quality of those relationships and what do those different folks bring to you that help you. So many times when people want to make a change, they'll start to tap into their network about, hey, here's what I want to do, here's why I want to do it. You either know me really well, what do you think? I like actually going also to the other end of people who know me not as well, and really saying, hey, poke holes in my thinking. What am I missing here? What would you advise me? You're not as close to me. Am I missing an opportunity? Is there something that would be of value to the organization that I haven't articulated? So it's really trying to take kind of the bookends of folks, because the people who know you well will give you good feedback and they'll help you, but they're more vested in your success and they're a little bit more myopic. So, and not that that's bad, but it may not give you that kind of more 360 perspective that you want and or need. And so I'm looking across a range of folks to kind of help me with that. I also think of networking not only across my peers, but also people who might be more senior to me. And that can kind of look like more of a mentoring kind of role over time. And also folks, depending on where you are in the organization, who might even be more junior to you, because sometimes they have a different perspective. And so I tend to see it as kind of a 360 process of where I'm looking for those different perspectives and those different ways of thinking that will challenge me and push me and not so much necessarily validate me.
And here's another one. I'm new to my job. My goal is to hold a certain position that's 2 levels above mine. I also want to leverage my skills by incorporating a particular task that's generally done by a different department. Do you have tips for how to handle this issue? Is it something I should handle together, or do I handle these 2 tasks or these 2 problems separately?
That's a good one. I think strategically, I'd probably start with defining that aspirational state of the 2 levels up. And so, what is motivating you to want to go up to those 2 levels? And then, assuming you can get support for that, what are the experiences, skills, knowledge, et cetera, that you need to get in terms of crafting your development plan to move on that path? A more tactical step on that path might be this task or tasks that you've identified that are, I think, tangential to your group, you said, but you have interest in, and if they help you kind of beyond the path to your overall goal, making a case for, hey, is there a possibility for me to actually take that on and then actually work with that team to sort of say, hey, I have an interest in this space. I'd love to be able to come over here and help you out. What could that look like? What value could I provide to you? And would you be willing to entertain that? And so that might be a first step in the context of your larger overall development plan of getting to those that 2 levels up.
Thank you. And here's another question. Do you have suggestions for job crafting in career fields that are fairly rigid? I'm a family practice physician assistant in an outpatient setting, and I would love to have more control over my day-to-day schedule and my duties, although it's a very rigid position.
That's a good one too. I mean, I think it depends on what aspects of control you're looking for. So I'm going to assume that by the rigidity you mean by the schedule and the hours you have to work, or you have to be in clinic and seeing patients. So I think it starts with, what are you looking to change, and then how best can that change be effectuated in the environment that you're in. So for instance, if you're looking for more control over your schedule, you might start to think about, well, what would that more control look like? Is that 4 10-hour days? Is it 3 12-hour days? Is it some time where you're leaving work a little bit earlier on some days? It's sort of getting clear on what are the what's that you want, and then starting to have a conversation with, well, how might that look in the context of the overall practice and then your patient panel in terms of meeting their needs as well. So really getting clear on where you feel like you don't have the control that you would otherwise like to have. What could it look like? And then what is the conversation and plan you would need to structure to be able to see what's possible? That's a good one. Actually, I haven't had too many folks come to me with that kind of specific, where they're kind of locked in terms of pretty strict scheduling.
And here's another question from a career changer. After 30 years in the same industry and job, I'm looking to make a change. Once I determine my passion, how do I figure out what careers are out there that fit the must, and how do I demonstrate my skills?
Wow, that's a big one. So I think that when you figure out your must, where I would go in terms of next steps would be, okay, within the context of that must, what are the strengths that you have that you could bring toward whatever the new thing you're heading towards is? What are the skills you've had previously that might either be directly related or at least tangentially related? What are some of the knowledge that you have? So being able to kind of, start to take the things that you've already done in your previous parts of your 30-year career and looking at where you're going in this future direction in terms of must. And then in terms of the actual specifics about the types of jobs and roles, well, it would really depend on kind of what motivates you, what you're really good at, and where do you want to deploy that energy in that time. And so there's no way I could answer right now in terms of specific industries and such, but having a good portfolio and understanding of what you do well, why you do it, and frankly, why are you wanting to make this change? So what are you wanting to leave behind that you actually want to see done differently going forward, or you want to be able to tap into a different part of your professional self, and then from there, crafting the more detailed plan going forward.
So you've talked about some strategies for gaining support from your boss, but we have a question here from someone who's asking, how would you deal with competitive coworkers or potentially subordinates who might try to undermine this process?
Yeah, I mean, that happens for sure. I think in terms of let's start with the coworkers, or what I'll call peers. First and foremost, it depends on kind of where they see you. My sense is your peers might be sensing that you're moving their cheese or kind of stepping into their turf. And so one way I've seen approach that, and I've done it too, is I try to identify an area within that area that I'm aiming for that either someone's not doing or they're not doing very well or a lot of. So I can start to kind of identify a unique value add, that's something where they might be competitive, but no one's really moving in that space right now, and maybe they haven't even thought about it. So in that regard, I would want to frame around, well, hey, I see this need, I don't see anybody else really doing it. I think I can add value here. What do you think? Because I think it would help you do X, Y, and Z. So in that particular thing, from a strategic kind of negotiation point of view, I'm really looking for the win-win. What's something that I can offer in that kind of competitive space that actually would make them better, but also not have them feel like I was stepping on their toes, so to speak.
Great. I think we have time for probably just 2 more here. As a generalization, would you say that it's easier to achieve job crafting at a smaller organization or a larger one, or and then also at a more senior level or a more junior one?
I don't think organizational type. Well, I take that back. In terms of the stage of the career, I don't think it matters, and I've seen people do it at all stages of their career. So I don't see as much of an issue with that. I think in terms of a large company versus a small company, many of the folks that I've worked with, they've been able to do job crafting quite effectively at medium to large companies, primarily because there's a lot more opportunities, and there's just lot more different places they can channel their energy and their skills. I've seen it done at small companies for sure. It kind of depends on what you're trying to aim for. So for instance, if you're trying to job craft into a position that's already filled or they have deep expertise, that might be a trickier sell. The advantage of smaller companies, or especially newer companies, when people who are coming on board, is a lot of times though things aren't set in stone and they're not particularly formalized yet. And so you may be able to come in and you're hired for X, but you're quickly looking around and you have interest in Y, and you're able to do some work there. So it does, I hate to give you the consultant answer, it depends kind of on the context and also the maturity of where that smaller organization is on their own development cycle.
Great. And then our last question, what about any tips you've got, Kevin, for a stay-at-home parent who is attempting job crafting for the first time in a decade?
First time in a, I didn't hear the last part, sorry.
First time in a decade.
Oh, yeah. So I don't think the process changes as much, at least the initial process, in terms of really reflecting back on, you know, I'm assuming this person worked previously, the previous 10 years or 10 years prior. So thinking about still strengths, skills that you have, skills that you want, knowledge that you have, I think it is, I mean, it is, I don't want to say it's harder. It's just very different in terms of, you know, re-entry back into the workforce. And so I haven't, in all honesty, I haven't worked with a lot of people who've had to make that transition. I have worked with some people who've transitioned back in the workforce from a long time at home, either caring for a child or an elderly parent. We've tended to focus less on the job crafting per se and more on, well, what is it that you really want to do in terms of this next phase of your career? And so it's been less about shaping the actual role itself and more figuring out about, okay, what, you know, where do I want to direct my energy in terms of kind of coming back in, and what's actually viable based on the skills and knowledge and experiences that I previously had, and where do I want to put those now in terms of laying a first stake in the ground. So I'm sorry, that's probably not the most satisfactory answer. I don't have a lot of expertise in that particular space.
Okay, great. Well, there was a lot of questions flowing in, so thank you all so much for being so engaged with this topic. And then a special thank you to you, Kevin, for giving us some really great actionable tips on this important topic.